The Pacific Ocean at dawn is a picture of serenity. The first golden light spills over an endless expanse of blue, its gentle swells brushing the sandy edges of the Hawaiian shore. Palm fronds sway lazily in the early breeze. Fishermen, barefoot and laughing, push their canoes into the water. Children chase each other along the tide line, their shouts mingling with the soft hiss of waves retreating back to the deep. But this morning is different. Far out, beyond the horizon, something stirs, something the eye cannot yet see, but the sea can feel. A subtle shift in the water's breathing. The seabirds notice it first. Their chatter cuts short. Wings beat urgently as they abandon the shoreline, rising into the sky like a warning unspoken. Then comes the silence. It is not the silence of peace, but of anticipation. The pause before the world changes. Beneath the ocean surface, nearly 3,000 miles to the north, two titanic slabs of the Earth's crust, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, have been locked together for centuries. They press, grind, and strain, holding back unimaginable force. And now they break. In a violent instant, the seafloor lurches upward. Billions of tons of water are thrust into motion, forming a massive pulse, a tsunami, born not from the wind or the tide, but from the raw convulsions of the planet itself. It races away from the Aleutian Islands at nearly 500 miles per hour, an invisible wall of destruction sweeping silently across the Pacific. Hours later, the first victims will be in Japan. On the Sanrika coast, fishermen look up from their nets to see the ocean pulling away, draining the harbor like a giant hand scooping water from a bowl. Bewildered, they stand frozen for a heartbeat too long. Then a roar. A towering wall of water surges toward the shore. Wooden boats are flung into the streets. Homes vanish in seconds. Historical records will note the event, but the cause will remain a mystery, a wave with no earthquake to blame, an orphan tsunami. In Hawaii, the story is told differently. Generations later, elders will speak of the day the sea climbed the mountains. They will remember how the water receded so far that fish flopped helplessly on bare sand. Children ran to gather them, not knowing what was coming. And then, over the curve of the sea, a dark, rolling wall rose higher and higher, swallowing the horizon. Villages were swept away. Canoes splintered. Survivors clung to palm trees as the ocean claimed the land. No one in 1585 knew that both disasters were the same event. No one understood that the origin lay in a violent rupture far away, in a chain of islands most of them had never heard of. For centuries, the truth lay buried. In Japanese scrolls recording the inexplicable wave, in Hawaiian sands hiding layers of coral and seashells far inland, in the silent scars on the ocean floor. It would take modern science to uncover the real story. Centuries later, researchers studying ancient coral in Hawaii and historical tsunami records in Japan would begin to see the pattern. Radiocarbon dating would match the layers of sand to the year 1585. Computer models would trace the wave's path back to the Aleutian subduction zone. And the magnitude they calculated, a staggering 9.25, would put it among the largest earthquakes in recorded history. The most unsettling discovery? That the fault line where it happened has been building stress for over 400 years. That it will break again. And that when it does, Hawaii will have just over 4 hours to prepare. It happened before history could truly remember. And if we ignore it, history might repeat, with all the fury of the Pacific. In the late 1500s, the Aleutian Islands were a place of raw, untamed beauty, a windswept chain of volcanic peaks stretching like a jagged spine between Alaska and Siberia. This was not a land of bustling ports or grand cities. It was a world ruled by the sea, where the storms could roar for days, where fog rolled in thick as wool, and where the line between ocean and sky often disappeared entirely. For the Unangan people, who had lived in the Aleutians for thousands of years, the ocean was both provider and predator. It offered fish, seals, and whales, life itself, but it could just as easily swallow boats and erase shorelines in a single storm. These islands sat directly atop the Aleutian subduction zone, a colossal geological boundary, where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the North American Plate. Few alive then could have imagined the scale of forces building silently beneath their feet. But the Aleutians were not isolated in the way they appeared on a map. Though separated by thousands of miles of ocean, they were part of a vast, interconnected Pacific world, one that stretched from the coasts of Japan to the volcanic peaks of Hawaii, from the fishing villages of Kamchatka to the jungles of the Philippines. Trade, migration, and oral stories linked these scattered islands and nations. Yet there was another, darker connection that few understood. A single fault line could send a wave from one end of this ocean to the other in less than a day. Across the ocean, Japan was deep in the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. It was a time of castles perched on misty hillsides, of armored samurai marching under the banners of rival warlords. Battles for power raged from one province to the next, and the people lived under constant tension, but not from the sea. Coastal villages along the Samarca coast were used to storms and rough seas, but in the year 1585, they had no way to predict or even imagine the arrival of a tsunami generated from an earthquake thousands of kilometers away. The concept of seismic waves traveling across oceans was beyond the reach of science at the time. Japan's scholars and leaders recorded disasters in handwritten chronicles, but their understanding was rooted in immediate causes, local storms, nearby quakes, or divine punishment. When the wave came, it would not only destroy lives, but also leave an enduring mystery in their records. Far south of the Aleutians, the Hawaiian Islands thrived under the stewardship of their chiefs, the Alii. In 1585, Hawaii was a tapestry of self-sufficient communities bound by tradition and rich oral storytelling. Life revolved around fishing, farming taro in terraced fields, and honoring the kapu, the sacred laws that governed every aspect of society. The ocean here was a living spirit. It was revered, respected, and feared. Legends spoke of great waves in the past, waves that climbed the hills and took whole villages. But without written records, the details faded with each generation, and the events of 1585 would be remembered not as a date in history, but as a story. The day the sea climbed the mountains. To the Hawaiians, it would be an omen. To modern scientists, centuries later, it would be a clue. Then, in June of that year, Japan's Samarca coast witnessed something extraordinary. One morning, the tide suddenly receded far beyond its normal limits, exposing the seafloor. Shellfish and stranded fish flopped helplessly in the sun. Some villagers rushed to gather them, curious and excited. Moments later, the ocean returned with terrifying speed, rising into a wall of water that smashed into the coastline, destroying homes and dragging people and boats out to sea. The destruction was recorded, but something about this tsunami didn't make sense. Usually, such waves followed a local earthquake, the tremor's warning of what was to come. But this time, there had been no shaking. No buildings rattled. No mountains quivered. The wave had come out of nowhere. 4 generations afterward, Japanese historians puzzled over it. They gave it a name, an orphan tsunami, a wave without a parent earthquake. And without the science to trace its origins across an entire ocean, it remained an unsolved mystery for more than 4 centuries. What no one in Japan, Hawaii, or the Aleutian Islands knew in 1585 was that they were all chapters in the same story, a story written by the shifting plates of the Earth itself. The Aleutian subduction zone had ruptured in a massive megathrust earthquake, sending a tsunami in every direction. Hawaii, lying just 2,800 miles to the south, would face the full brunt of the waves. Japan, far to the west, would still feel its reach 9 hours later. But in that moment, none of them could see the connection. To the people of the Aleutians, it was the wrath of the sea. To the Hawaiians, it was the return of an old legend. To the Japanese, it was a strange, parentless wave from a distant and invisible cause. The Pacific, vast and beautiful, had revealed another truth that day. That distance offers no protection when the sea decides to rise. It begins with signs only the wild creatures notice. Sea otters vanish from their rocky coves, slipping into deeper waters. Seabirds wheel in frantic circles, then take flight toward the mainland. Along the shore, The air feels heavy, charged, like the moments before a storm. Fishermen in skin-covered kayaks look up from their nets, puzzled at the sudden stillness. Beneath the waves, something far greater than any storm is unfolding. Two colossal tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, have been locked together for centuries along the Aleutian subduction zone. The Pacific Plate has been slowly but relentlessly pushing beneath its neighbor, storing energy like a spring wound too tight. For 400 years, that spring has been winding. Now it snaps. At first, there is only a deep, resonant groan from the Earth's crust, a sound more felt than heard. The seafloor convulses. In one violent motion, hundreds of kilometers of fault rupture, the seabed heaving upward by several meters. Billions of tons of seawater are shoved aside in an instant. This is a megathrust earthquake, with a magnitude scientists centuries later will estimate at MW 9.25, one of the largest in human history. In those few seconds, more energy is released than in all the world's nuclear weapons combined. The surface above is transformed. The ocean, disturbed by the sudden displacement, forms a massive pulse, a tsunami. Not a single wave, but a series of enormous water walls, radiating outward from the rupture zone in every direction. In deep water, the waves are barely noticeable, their crests perhaps a meter high, but stretching hundreds of kilometers from peak to peak. Yet they travel at frightening speed, faster than a passenger jet, carrying their full, hidden force toward distant shores. Morning breaks calm over the San Rica coast. Fishermen row their boats into the familiar waters, their minds on their nets and the day's catch. Then something strange catches their eyes. The tide is moving, but not in its usual rhythm. The water is retreating, draining away from the shore at an impossible speed. In minutes, the harbor empties, exposing rocks and seaweed rarely seen. Fish flop helplessly on the wet sand. Some rush forward, baskets in hand, to gather the bounty. Others shout warnings, uneasy at the unnatural sight. Then, from the far horizon, a line appears, a dark, rising wall that seems to grow larger by the second. The sound comes next, a low, deep roar, like 1,000 drums beating beneath the sea. By the time the realization hits, it's already too late. The wave strikes with unimaginable force. Boats are hurled into streets, houses splinter like kindling, and entire families are swept away. The water rushes inland, swallowing everything in its path before retreating, dragging the wreckage and the people back into the sea. When the survivors gather later, they are shaken. There had been no earthquake, no shaking, just the sudden arrival of the killer wave. The elders write it down, puzzled. An orphan tsunami, a child with no parent quake, far to the south, in the Hawaiian Islands. The day begins in warmth and sunlight. Coastal villages hum with activity, fishermen preparing canoes, children chasing each other along the beach, women weaving mats from pandanus leaves. Then, the ocean begins to behave strangely. The tide pulls away, farther and faster than anyone can remember. Fish litters the exposed seabed. Children rush forward, laughing and scooping them up. Dogs bark wildly. The elders' expressions turn grim. Some have heard this story before, in whispered tales passed down for generations. They know what comes next. Over the curve of the sea, a shadow rises. It grows taller, darker, until it blocks the horizon, a wall of water taller than the coconut palms. It moves with terrible inevitability. There is no outrunning it. The first wave crashes ashore, shattering canoes and smashing huts to pieces. Palm trees bend and snap under the water's weight. People are swept from the beaches, clinging desperately to whatever floats, a log, a fishing float, even a tree trunk ripped from the earth. But the danger is not over. The second wave follows, and the third, each one dragging more debris inland before sucking it back out to sea. In some valleys, the waves climb high into the hills, tearing through gardens and scattering pigs and chickens. When the water finally recedes, the coastline is unrecognizable. Whole communities are gone. Survivors sit on high ground, shivering and silent, staring at the ocean as if expecting it to return. In less than a day, the megathrust rupture in the Aleutians has touched shores thousands of miles apart. In the Aleutian Islands, the earthquake itself caused the greatest damage, the ground splitting, cliffs collapsing, and the ocean surging inland. In Hawaii, the waves erased entire villages. In Japan, they struck without warning, leaving only confusion and questions. None of them knew they had been struck by the same disaster. None of them could imagine the hidden fault beneath the Aleutian seabed, or the way its violent shudder had sent death racing across the Pacific. Centuries later, scientists will trace the path of that wave, modeling its journey from the rupture zone to each coastline. They will find the sand deposits in Hawaii, read the scrolls of Japan, and connect the dots that the people of 1585 could not. But on that day, June 11th, the Pacific had reminded its people of a hard truth. The ocean does not need storms to kill. Sometimes it needs only to breathe. The Aleutian Islands, where the earthquake began, were remote, sparsely populated, and home primarily to the Anangan people. Their history was passed down through oral tradition, not written accounts. The 1585 rupture may have shaken their villages, caused landslides, or sent waves surging into their coves, but without a written record, their story was destined to fade with each generation. By the time European explorers arrived in the region centuries later, the event existed, if at all, only as fragments of memory. A tale told around a fire, a warning about the sea's sudden anger. But to the outside world, it had never happened. Thousands of miles west, on the Sanrika coast of Japan, the disaster left a mark, but only in the form of confusion. Historical records describe the tsunami of June 1585 in detail. How the tide pulled back unnaturally far, how the returning wall of water smashed homes, fishing boats, and rice fields. But there was one crucial detail missing. There had been no earthquake. No trembling of the earth to warn the villagers. No rattling teacups or collapsing walls. To the scholars of the time, this was inexplicable. They called it an orphan tsunami, a child without a parent quake. They recorded the date, the destruction, and the strange absence of shaking. But without the knowledge of faraway tectonic faults, they could not trace the wave's origin in Hawaii. The event took on a different life. There were no scrolls, no inked chronicles. But there were stories, and in Hawaii, stories were sacred. They were the memory of the people, passed from elder to child, and from child to elder in turn. Hawaiian oral history speaks of a day when the sea receded so far that fish littered the sand, of children running to gather them, of elders shouting warnings, of a wall of water that came climbing the mountains, tearing villages from the shore. Unlike Japan's precise written date, Hawaii's account blurred over time. The story could have been from decades ago or centuries. The exact year was lost, but the image remained vivid, a warning to never trust a retreating tide. For hundreds of years, the 1585 tsunami remained an unsolved puzzle. Scholars in Japan considered it a curious footnote, perhaps the result of an undersea landslide or a strange weather phenomenon. In Hawaii, it was remembered as a legendary storm or a punishment from the gods. Without the ability to detect distant earthquakes, the idea that a quake in the Aleutian Islands could devastate shores thousands of miles away was unimaginable. And so, the disaster was filed away in two very different boxes. In Japan, a historical oddity. In Hawaii, a piece of cultural mythology. The truth only began to surface centuries later, when scientists studying Hawaiian geology noticed something strange. In several low-lying coastal areas, particularly in Kauai, there were layers of coral, shells, and marine sand buried far inland, sandwiched between normal soil. Radiocarbon dating placed these deposits in the late 1500s. That was unusual enough, but when researchers compared this date to historical tsunami records in Japan, they found a match: June 1585. Further computer simulations confirmed that a massive earthquake in the eastern Aleutian subduction zone could produce a tsunami that would arrive in Hawaii about 4.5 hours later and in Japan about 9 hours later, with wave heights matching both the Hawaiian geological evidence and the Japanese written records. The orphan tsunami finally had a parent. And not just any parent, but one of the most powerful earthquakes in human history. The rediscovery of the 1585 earthquake wasn't just an academic triumph. It was a warning. The fault that produced it has been locked for over 400 years, steadily building pressure. Scientists now know it's capable of producing another event just as devastating. If such a quake happened today, Hawaii would have a few hours to evacuate. Japan would have less than half a day. Coastal Alaska would have minutes. The problem is, unlike in 1585, today's Pacific is far more crowded. Millions more people live within reach of the sea. Cities, ports, and tourist resorts now stand where fishing villages once were. What was once a forgotten story has become one of the most urgent warnings in Pacific disaster science. The story begins, not with crashing waves, but with quiet clues hidden in the earth. By the late 20th century, Pacific scientists had pieced together an impressive archive of historical earthquakes and tsunamis. Japan's written records stretched back centuries. Hawaii's coastlines held geological time capsules beneath their sand. But one event kept surfacing like a shadow, an unexplained tsunami in 1585 that didn't fit any known earthquake. In the early 1990s, geologists surveying low-lying coastal plains on Kauai noticed something strange. Beneath layers of ordinary soil and vegetation sat a band of ocean material, coral fragments, seashells, and marine sand, deposited far inland, well beyond the reach of even the highest storm waves. The layer was thick in some places, thinner in others, but always distinctly different from the natural sand beneath it. This wasn't slow erosion. It wasn't hurricane debris. It was the fingerprint of a catastrophic inundation. Using radiocarbon dating, scientists measured the age of tiny shells and coral pieces trapped in that layer. The results pointed to the late 1500s, a time before European contact with Hawaii, when local history was preserved in chants and oral traditions. The Hawaiian elder stories came rushing back to mind, the day the sea climbed the mountains. Until now, researchers had assumed these were myths. But the sand told a different story, one of a tsunami so large it could sweep marine debris hundreds of meters inland. Half a world away, in the archives of Japan, the Sanriku Coast's history keepers had long known about the tsunami of June 1585. Hand-drawn scrolls and written records described how the tide pulled out dramatically, exposing the seafloor, before returning as a monstrous wave. The problem? No one had felt an earthquake. Not in Sanriku, not anywhere nearby. Japanese historians had labeled the event an orphan tsunami, a wave without a local quake to give it birth. In the 1500s, the cause was unknowable. Even in the 1900s, scientists struggled to imagine a tsunami that could arrive without warning from shaking. That is, until they compared notes with their Hawaiian counterparts. In the late 1990s, a small group of tsunami researchers began noticing the date overlap. The Hawaiian sand layer, radiocarbon dated to the late 1500s, lined up closely with Japan's 1585 orphan tsunami. The odds of two unrelated tsunamis striking opposite sides of the Pacific in the same decade were astronomically low. There had to be a common source. If so, that source had to be huge, big enough to send waves thousands of miles in opposite directions, each still large enough to cause devastation when they arrived. Attention turned to the Aleutian subduction zone, the sweeping arc where the Pacific plate dives beneath the North American plate. It's one of the most powerful earthquake factories on Earth, responsible for the 1964 Alaska quake, NW 9.2, and the 1946 Aleutian quake, NW 8.6. Computer modeling suggested that if a megathrust rupture occurred in the eastern Aleutians, it could send a focused tsunami south toward Hawaii and west toward Japan. The Aleutians acted like a geological slingshot, a perfect location to fire massive waves across the Pacific. The challenge was proving it. There were no written records from the Aleutians in 1585 and no direct measurements of the quake. But science had another tool, sediment analysis. Researchers compared the Hawaiian deposits with similar sand layers in coastal Alaska. On Sedanka Island and parts of Unalaska, they found matching signatures, marine sand pushed far inland and buried beneath later soil layers. Radiocarbon dating placed those deposits in the late 16th century, exactly when Hawaii's and Japan's evidence pointed. With the geological evidence pointing to the Aleutians, the next step was to test whether such a quake could reproduce the historical accounts. Using advanced tsunami modeling software, scientists created a virtual earthquake along a 1,000-kilometer stretch of the eastern Aleutian Trench. They assigned it a staggering magnitude of 9.25, putting it among the largest quakes in human history. The simulations were uncanny. Waves reached Hawaii in about 4.5 hours, towering more than 10 meters high in some coastal areas, easily capable of pushing coral and sand far inland. Waves reached Japan's Sanrika coast in 9 hours, arriving with the same speed and height recorded in the 1585 documents. The energy distribution matched perfectly. Hawaii and Japan each got a direct hit, while other parts of the Pacific saw smaller but still significant waves. It was the geological equivalent of matching a suspect's fingerprints to a crime scene. From myths to measured history, the realization was sobering. The 1585 event had been a Pacific-wide catastrophe, born in one of the most remote corners of the ocean. For Hawaii, it meant that what had once been dismissed as legend was now recognized as literal history, a warning encoded in story form. For Japan, it meant that the orphan tsunami was finally adopted, its cause traced not to a local storm, but to a distant megathrust rupture. And for modern science, it meant confronting a terrifying truth. The Aleutian Trench is still locked, still capable of producing another magnitude 9+ quake at any time. If a similar event happened now, the consequences would be far worse. In 1585, Hawaii's and Japan's coastlines were dotted with fishing villages. Today, they're lined with cities, ports, tourist resorts, and nuclear power plants. Modern warning systems would give Hawaii about 4 hours and Japan about 9 hours to evacuate. But in Alaska, where the waves would hit within minutes, survival would depend entirely on immediate, instinctive action. The 1585 quake also changed how scientists think about Paleotsunami research. No longer were ancient deposits just curiosities. They became vital tools in mapping the true reach of seismic hazards. By reading the sand, coral, and shells beneath our feet, scientists can glimpse disaster centuries before written records began. It's hard to comprehend the raw scale of what happened that day in 1585. A magnitude of MW 9.25, a number that makes even modern seismologists pause, places this event among the true giants of recorded geological history. Bigger than the catastrophic 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, and on par with the legendary 1960 Chile earthquake, it was an event that redefined the limits of what the Earth's crust is capable of when pushed to the breaking point. Far beneath the cold, churning waters of the Aleutian Arc, the Pacific Plate had been sliding inexorably toward its fate. For centuries, it pressed against the North American Plate at the subduction zone, a vast underwater fault that stretches like a hidden scar across the ocean floor. Day after day, year after year, the plates locked together, storing energy that no human could detect, but that nature never forgets. Then, in a sudden, almost incomprehensible instant, the bond failed. The seafloor lurched upward by several meters, the rupture stretching for hundreds of kilometers in a single, violent release. This movement displaced billions of tons of seawater, setting in motion a tsunami that would cross the Pacific Basin like a thrown stone sends ripples across a pond. Except these ripples were walls of water taller than a 3-story building. From the Aleutians to Hawaii, the distance is vast, yet the waves traveled it in roughly 4.5 hours, racing across open ocean at speeds approaching those of a jetliner. By the time they reached Hawaiian shores, the water rose between 10 and 20 meters in places, enough to erase entire coastal villages in minutes. Outrigger canoes, homes, fishing huts, everything was either smashed to kindling or swept far inland. Those who survived spoke of the ocean climbing the mountains, a phrase that sounds poetic until you realize it was their desperate attempt to describe the impossible. Farther west, the same pulse of destruction continued its journey. In around 9 hours, it reached the Sanrika coast of Japan, a region that has always lived with the sea's dual nature, life-giving and deadly. Here, The wave was smaller but still lethal, striking without the warning of an earthquake tremor. It rose suddenly from the horizon and collapsed onto fishing communities, sweeping away boats, nets, and lives. The fishermen of the time could not have imagined that the cause lay thousands of kilometers away in an icy, uninhabited chain of islands they had never even heard of. Even for today's scientists, the scale of this event is staggering. To rupture such a massive section of fault line requires unimaginable amounts of stored energy, the kind that accumulates over centuries of relentless plate movement. The 1585 Aleutian earthquake didn't just reshape the seafloor, it rewrote the Pacific's memory, leaving scars in coral, sand, and human stories scattered across 3 distant lands. And yet, for centuries, its true nature lay hidden, as silent and invisible as the fault that spawned it. The Aleutian subduction zone, the same hidden fault that unleashed the 1585 megathrust quake, has been eerily quiet ever since. For geologists, that silence is not comforting, it's ominous. It suggests the plates have been locked again for more than 4 centuries, slowly but relentlessly building up strain. The same forces that once displaced entire swaths of ocean floor are still at work, pressing, grinding, and storing energy that will one day have to be released. If such an earthquake struck in our time, the Pacific would once again become a vast arena for destruction. In Hawaii, the warning window would be shockingly short, perhaps only 4 to 5 hours between the detection of the quake and the arrival of the first waves. It sounds like a decent amount of time until you consider the logistics, evacuating entire coastal communities, moving the sick and elderly, clearing traffic, and getting everyone to higher ground before the ocean arrives. Even a well-coordinated, technologically advanced system would struggle to move people fast enough. For the coastal villages of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands themselves, there would be no such luxury. Depending on their location, they might have only minutes between the first tremor and the arrival of the tsunami. In some places, the ground might still be shaking as the first wall of water crashes ashore. Evacuation here would depend entirely on instant action. No hesitation, no gathering belongings, just a desperate race uphill. In a modern replay, the devastation would extend far beyond the loss of life. Economic damage could soar into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Ports, harbors, and coastal industries across the Pacific, from fisheries to shipping hubs, could be crippled. Low-lying neighborhoods in Hawaii could vanish under walls of water. Parts of Alaska's infrastructure could be erased entirely. Japan, still deeply aware of what tsunamis can do, would face another sudden strike along vulnerable coasts. Entire supply chains could collapse, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Now imagine seeing it unfold from space. From a satellite's view, the sea's surface would shift and swell, subtle at first, then radiating concentric arcs that expand outward at terrifying speed. The energy would travel invisibly across the deep ocean, but near shorelines, those smooth arcs would suddenly rear up into waves capable of swallowing buildings. A simulation of the 1585 quake projected onto modern maps would show bright bands of wave energy shooting from the Aleutians like ripples from a stone, striking Hawaii, Japan, the U.S. West Coast, and even parts of South America within hours. In emergency operations centers, screens would fill with evacuation maps flashing in real time, entire swaths of coastline turning from green to yellow to red as the water approaches. Sirens would wail. Text alerts would blare from millions of phones. Helicopters might sweep low over beaches, broadcasting warnings in multiple languages. In some places, elevated highways would become temporary refugee routes. In others, people would have to climb natural hillsides or man-made tsunami towers. And yet, despite our satellites, deep ocean sensors, and instant communications, the same haunting truth would remain. We cannot stop it. The ocean, once set in motion by a megathrust quake, is unstoppable. All we can do is move out of its path. The 1585 event is not just a piece of distant history. It's a warning written in the language of geology and water. It reminds us that the Pacific is a single, connected system, that what happens in one remote corner can reach across thousands of kilometers to strike another. The next time this fault slips, it will not care that centuries have passed, that our ports are bigger, our cities taller, or our global economy more fragile. The lesson is brutally simple. When the sea turns against us, the only defense is to be ready before it happens. The ocean keeps its secrets. For years, for centuries, it holds them close. The stories of mountains shifting beneath the waves, of invisible scars stretching for hundreds of miles along the seafloor. It waits in silence, wearing the calm face of gentle tides and mirrored horizons. But the ocean is not still. It is listening, breathing, remembering. In 1585, it broke its silence. Without warning, it rose up and swept across the Pacific, erasing villages, carrying memories far from their shores, and leaving behind only whispers in human history. In Japan, they called it an orphan, a wave without a parent. In Hawaii, it became a story told beside fires under the stars, the day the sea climbed the mountains. And in the Aleutians, where no one lived to tell it, the truth slept beneath cold winds and restless waters. Centuries have passed. The coasts have grown busier. Harbors hum with ships. Planes trace the skies overhead, and cities sprawl where there were once only trees and sand. People walk the beaches without knowing that the water lapping at their feet once came for everything. The signs are there, buried in sand, etched into coral, written in old scrolls, but only those who study the deep know how to read them. Somewhere far beneath the Aleutian chain, the two great plates still press together. The strain grows grain by grain, year by year, invisible to the eyes of those living above. It does not matter that the world is faster now, or that satellites watch from space. The ocean has all the time it needs. One day, the silence will break again. The sea will pull back, drawing breath, and then return with a force that cares nothing for the lives or histories in its path. The same waters that bring life and trade and beauty will rise without mercy, just as they did before. The only question is, when that day comes, will we be ready? The screen lingers on a calm Aleutian beach, pale light on wet sand, the wind brushing across the water. For a moment, it feels eternal, unchanging. Then, somewhere deep below, a low, distant rumble begins to grow, so faint at first it could be imagined. The image holds, the rumble swells, and the scene fades to black.